Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our first BSI Built Environment webinar for 2025. For those of us that haven't met before, my name is Ant Burd, and I'm Director of Built Environment here in BSI Knowledge Solutions, so the standards and national standards body part of the BSI group. It is my privilege to welcome you all today and to be your host for this webinar. But before we get into our built environment update with our fantastic lineup of BSI speakers, BSI Built Environment team, just a bit of housekeeping to begin with, please. Next slide. For those of you that have joined us before, this is very much a listen-only webinar, but it is being recorded, okay? We really welcome your questions via the Q&A function, which will be answered after the presentations where we'll all come together. Simply click on the Q&A button in the side panel that you have before you and post your question. I cannot make it clear enough. What gives the greatest value to the webinars that we run with you and for you are the questions we get. We've been really lucky. We've got a great lineup of questions that have been pre-submitted, but please don't hesitate to ask more in the chat. By the same token, if you experience any technical difficulties, please submit your issue via the same Q&A function, and the events team will sort you out of that, I'm sure. And in a similar way, upon completion of the feedback survey, we will send a link to the recording of this entire webinar. Yes, it is CPD recognised, very important to me too, but please request your certificate via the feedback survey following the webinar. Okay, next slide, please. So what are we here to talk to you today about? Well, it's very much a built environment update, and it brings together the built environment team that sits within Knowledge Solutions, which is our all-important committee team, an all-important sector team, but we do work as one collective team, okay? In the usual style, over the next sort of 50 minutes, I'll give you a bit of an update, then I'll hand over to colleagues covering health and safety and well-being, fire safety more broadly, sustainability, and then not least digital and quality thereafter. Then we'll all come back together for a panel session, and I can sort of feed out some questions that I've already got, but please keep them coming live as we are here today. Next slide, please. Just as a bit of way of background for those of you that aren't aware, BSI is a Royal Charter organisation, okay, and we're here to coordinate the efforts of companies and persons for the improvement, standardisation and simplification of materials, products and processes. In terms of the national standards body, that is set out within an updated MOU with His Majesty's government, and we're appointed by government to undertake that function. So when you look at the boxes before you there, myself and my colleagues that you'll hear from today sit within the knowledge standards piece, really the national standards body. But BSI is a huge group, some close to 6,000 people in fact. And the larger part of our business, which is directly separated by a code of good conduct between the NSB and wider activities, also covers consultancy, voluntary certification, and where needed, maybe for healthcare products and construction products, maybe an aspect of mandatory certification. But we do not sit within that part of the BSI group. Next slide, please. Again, I'm sure people are very much aware of this, but standards quite simply are a consensus of what good looks like. They are consensus. You know, we do consult upon our standards. They are typically voluntary as well, and that's something that might come out today in part of this session. And they're there to support companies and people to build trust and improve performance, okay? We can produce a myriad of different types of standards, from specifications, test methodologies, codes of good practice, etc. But they're a currency, they're a language that allows interaction and interoperability between people, products and services. And that's what's key. Next slide, please. So from a built environment perspective, which has been probably the most established sector that sits, and I mean a collective sector, including committee, that sit within BSI, we're probably the longest established, as I say. We define built environment as a collection of man-made or induced physical objects located in a particular area or region. The market is huge. The construction sector is expected to grow even in these difficult times to build out to about £15.5 trillion globally by 2030. That equates to around circa 14% of the world's GDP. bit smaller in the UK. We're about 6 to 8% at any one time. And of that market share, the UK is but 1.7%, but it's a very important 1.7%. Yep, lion's share definitively is China, the United States, Japan, and India, who collectively are worth about 50% of that value. And we cannot underplay the importance of construction products or their value and importance, which we'll touch upon later. But that's about 1.3 trillion pounds globally as well. So we're a big player, a massive amount of construction output, but also we're a big user of energy. Okay, and as we continue down the path of transition to net zero, typically the built environment, 30% of global energy-related carbon emissions are attributable to buildings and assets such as infrastructure. If you include materials and products in that, we're about 40% of the problem, which is why sustainability and transition to net zero are truly so important for our sector. And yes, when we move around the globe, as a sector, it's typically highly regulated, albeit at times you might not believe it, but we'll probably touch upon that too. Next slide, please. Just very simply to break that down in terms of construction sector output, and these are 2023 figures from National Audit Office. It was published last November. So 2023, we saw an uplift from 22. We went from £187 billion construction output to 211. The pie diagram gives you a bit of a breakdown there in terms of the areas of focus, which we find very helpful with our committee experts as well and committees to start exploring where additional support might be needed. What is interesting is, of course, repair and maintenance is a huge component part of output, as is housing and similar. And just at the bottom there, and it only came into my inbox yesterday from the Construction Products Association winter forecast, they expect construction output in 2025 and 2026 is likely to be an improvement on 23, which is this, and last year in totality. However, we are expecting a slower economic growth forecast with fewer rate cuts expected than before the government's autumn budget. The construction recovery is likely to be gradual, and I think we can see that and we recognise that. Next slide, please. Major areas of UK investment. Very important to BSI because quite often we're invited in on some of these activities to support and suggest what standards might be of help and assistance, and quite often they'll ask for new standards to be developed. So you have a list on the left-hand side of UK major construction programmes. You know, it's quite interesting to look at that. A lot of that is all about energy production and infrastructure. So the Hornsey project, the largest one there, is offshore, but many other too. And you know, this is what's driving much of our activity. On the right-hand side, you've got the current UK research programmes landscape. I don't think there'll be any surprises there. But again, we work with many of these listed here with a view of where they're developing solutions or where there's an aspect of research that they need to formalise and capture as good practice. Then quite often we'll come in as BSI to help develop that and then publish and make available to the marketplace. So hugely important to the UK. Next slide, please. But just to put that into context, and I've mentioned the importance of our amazing committee team that is the built environment, just so people clearly understand, BSI has an overarching top committee, the SPSC, Standards, Policy and Strategy, and then we have two top strategic advisory committees, CB0, Construction and Built Environment Sector Policy, beneath which we have some from CB1 all the way to FNB1 there, advisory panels, and to actually get into the depths of what they're considering, be it construction products or CB3 and similar. And then we have quite literally hundreds of technical committees overseen by our committee team, but you know, chaired and attended by committee experts that give their time and their employers' time in spades, and we couldn't do it without them or you. FSH 0, Fire and Built Environment Sector Policy, very pertinent, very relevant. And again, what sits beneath that are a number of technical committees. We're very lucky. We've just said goodbye to Peter Capelhorn, who stepped down as chair of CB0, and now that's Dr. Hal Davis, who I'm sure people will be very much aware of, has now taken over as chair. FSH 0, Sir Ken Knight has now stepped down from the chair of FSH 0 and has now been replaced by Aman Sharma, which is a great thing to happen for us and the industry. Next slide, please. What that means, just to get into the depths, you're talking around 260 built environment committees that actually give their time and consideration to the development of national technical committees, subcommittees, and SEN and ISO technical committees and secretariat. So a massive amount of activity in the team, and we're here actually from Simon and Cara as part of our update. That means at any one time about 800 active work items. That could be new standards, that could be revisions and core agenda. So an awful lot going on at any one time. We break that down. You won't be surprised by sort of horizontal thematics, its design, its construction products, not least because we have over 1,200 standards in that space. It's building operations. It's definitively sustainability when we think about the impact of buildings and infrastructure in terms of carbon emitted, etc. And then fire has always been a massive part of our portfolio too, and continues to be. And so priority areas are really what we're going to be covered in the next sort of hour and a bit with the team. And then a number of standards beneath, just as examples, but these will be touched upon in each of the separate presentations you're about to receive. So I suggest that's enough of me. Let's get into the detail and let's hear from colleagues in terms of health, safety and well-being. Over to you, Ian and Cara.
Thanks, Ant, and good afternoon, everybody. As always, it's a pleasure to be able to speak to you at the start of the year. My name is Ian Richardson. I'm one of the sector leads that you're going to hear from this afternoon. I work for Ant, and my colleagues are also on this call too to talk about their respective areas. So from my perspective, as you'll see from the following slides, the areas that I'm responsible for are things like construction products and competence in the built environment, as well as quality management. So when we talk about health, safety and well-being, that's usually the slant that I take on that topic. But of course, my colleague Cara Ebanks is joining me for this particular slide, so she will fill in the rest of the health, safety and well-being content. So where do we begin? So we've got some headings there of maintain, grow and develop as the sort of three pillars of how we're going to move forward in this year, starting with quite naturally, as Ant touched on in his intro slide, talking about a heavily regulated industry. There is a period of regulatory reform that is no doubt ongoing now, continued support that we provide to our regulators, MHCLG, as they're now known, following the Labour government coming into power last July, and construction product reform, reflecting a journey that I think we've been on since Dame Judith Hackett's report, post-Grenfell, and the recommendations in 2018, the Morell Day Testing for a Safer Future report in 2023, to the final report of the Grenfell Tower inquiry that you will have seen appear in September last year, and then awaiting the government response to that and their recommendations due by March. So we stand ready to support as that regulatory reform continues throughout this year and beyond. And then, of course, that applies again to the Office of Product Safety and Standards, OPSS, who sit under the Department for Business and Trade, DBT, as the construction products regulator. And we have supported, we will continue to support OPSS in its role as the construction products regulator, including its role, its enforcement role and compliance to designated standards. The other regulator, of course, out there is the building safety regulator, and we have conversations with them both in terms of competence and construction products, the introduction of the Building Safety Act, the role of the Health and Safety Executive as the building safety regulator, closely connected to them to ensure that standards provide a mechanism for helping demonstrate compliance with aspects of the Act which relate to competence and construction products. So, Cara, you will probably pick up on this as part of your next session. So if you're okay, I'll hand over to you for that bit, please.
Of course, thanks, Ian. So the first part in terms of the standards response, specifically in terms of standards, which I'll talk a lot about, is Eurocodes. And Eurocodes are perhaps the largest response that we'll have for the number of standards responding to regulatory reform this year and perhaps into next year, simply because there are so many of them. So for those who aren't aware, Eurocodes are a series of standards covering around 10 themes and that provide a common approach to the structural design of buildings and their civil engineering works. and they're recommended and referenced for technical specifications in many public contracts. And from a market perspective, Eurocodes help make European companies more competitive and increase safety in the construction industry as well. Because we are the NSB and a member of CEN, we have an obligation to adopt them, and so that's that tie in there in terms of competitiveness. And specifically, the standards themselves, like I say, they cover 10 themes, and they form a suite of around about 70 European standards and 70 UK national annexes, separate documents, and some of which have already been published and will continue to do so throughout this year, next year, and into 2027. The next impact is on the machinery directive, and this is related to the built environment and covers safety components, lifting accessories, chains and ropes. And the 2006 directive repealed, and the new one applies from January 27 as well. A number of important standards are affected, one of which is 16005 power operated pedestrian door sets. So safety in use. So that's a major thing that we're looking into specifically in relating to standards. One of the biggest areas, and one which again Ian will touch on as well, is competency. So converted from a BSI Flex, new British standard 8670 Part 1 has published, and that's competence frameworks for building safety. So that's the core document within that suite. And the goal of this is to help raise levels of individual professional competence across the built environment in support of the new building safety regime. Colleagues Simon and Chris are going to talk about Grenfell, but obviously competence within the built environment is a large area related to that as well. 8670 Part 1 is supported by 3 PAS documents, 8671, 2 and 3, all of which are published and available if you wanted to download them as well. Lastly on this list here is ISO 6082, and that will publish this month, and it's on construction project governance, so it's guidance on delivery management, so that's another key document as well. Moving over to the next area, so onto building safety, 8674 built environment, so that's a framework for competence of individual fire risk assessors, and again colleagues Simon and Chris are going to talk a lot more about fire later on. But it continues with 8674 and will be at public comment, so DPC in March, and I'll come on to where you can find that later on. And the second part of 8670 Part 2, building safety and competence frameworks as well, that will publish, and that's at the early stages of proposal, that one. Next on my list is organisational capability. So the Building Safety Act 2022 requires that organisations will need to evidence that they have the necessary organisational capability. So therefore, scoping work on what a standard would cover is taking place right now, including bringing in existing work on this topic, such as that produced by the Building Safety Alliance, and then drafting of a BSI standard, a formal standard will begin. And this builds on the previous 8670 framework standards I've previously mentioned, and moving towards standardization of competence for an organization rather than just the individual themselves. So really elevates that subject area. And Simon, Ian, I'll pass back over to you.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Cara. Yeah, so we continue that, as we referred quite a lot already to the Grenfell Tower Inquiry final report at the outset of this section. I feel as though, having worked at BSI for over 20 years in lots of different roles, this is one of the most critical standards that I've ever seen and never worked on. And we will see this appear in the next 12 months or so. Work is only just beginning. But it's a new standard which will support the safety of construction products being launched onto the market. The aim of this code of practice will be to set out the steps which a responsible product manufacturer would need to follow in order to be able to demonstrate that in placing a construction product on the market in the UK, they had undertaken due diligence and exercised reasonable skill and care in the development, assessment and ongoing production of the product. And this may also include support through active after-sales activity and ongoing product development in response to user experience and feedback. So this critical standard on the back of the findings, as we mentioned before, with the Morale Day Testing for a Safer Future report and the Grenfell Tower Inquiry final report, will be huge. And we hope that the industry will engage with that, as Cara says, when we talk about drafts for public comment. We expect there'll be a lot of interest at that stage. And then just moving into the final pillar, when we talk about, outside of perhaps the formal standards development process that we've touched on for this area, what other supporting tools and guidance can we produce that would allow us to both promote the standards and how they should be used, but also hear from you as the industry on their use. We are considering a competence hub at the moment in order to provide that platform for the industry to better understand standards and guidance on competence in the built environment. But it will also allow us to collaborate and discuss pertinent topics within that community. And the Committee for Competence are very supportive of the possible benefits the hub could bring, as are bodies that we work with through that, such as the Industry Competence Steering Group. And finally, just very briefly before I hand back to Cara to close. Again, we've got a new version of the construction products, the EU Construction Products Regulation. That revision is coming, is in place now, and it links to the eventual introduction of potentially digital product passports for construction products. So, Cara, an enormous amount there, and to some extent we only touch on these very briefly, but perhaps you could just finish off by explaining that impact of standards a bit more. Thank you very much.
Sure, yeah. I mean, we have just scratched the surface really on a lot of this, and it's a lot of numbers and things. So, but to continue on, so Dan, my colleague, will discuss later the presentation on quality in the built environment. But from a standards perspective, in the area that I work in, which is committees, there is a new technical committee, B570, and that's on quality in the built environment, and that was put together and created at the end of last year. And their remit will essentially be building on the 99001, and they'll be building on that, and new standards will fall underneath it. Construction products, Ian has mentioned construction products competency. Quality is a general theme that you'll hear throughout this presentation, but as Ian mentioned, the construction products reform, it will have a great impact on hundreds of standards that are cited in regulation. And mentioned the committee structure. So the committees are led by CB0, Strategic Committee in the Built Environment, and then we're looking at CB3 as well, which is specifically on construction products, and seeing what we can do to really advise the suite of standards that we've got already and what we can do to build on that. So CB3, CB0 are really key to a construction products standards response. Lastly, there's a new area of work on suicide prevention. So BSI it has convened a group of stakeholders to develop a best practice guidance standard on suicide prevention, intervention, postvention for the workplaces. Now, there's some more detail and background for this work and our progress in a recent article for IOSH, for Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. And if you simply just Google IOSH suicide prevention, the likely result will be an article titled Suicide Prevention, a Workplace Standard in Progress. So very early work on that, but very, very key. And I think next that finishes it for Ian and I will hand over to colleagues Simon and Chris.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Simon Hamlet. I'm the Senior Standards Manager for Built Environment and Fire here at BSI, and I'm joined by my colleague Chris Smith-Wotton, and he is the Lead Standards Development Manager for Fire. And we're very pleased to be speaking to you today. Now, as Ian mentioned, and as I'm sure everybody watching this webinar is well aware, the final report of the Grenfell Tower inquiry, chaired by Sir Martin Moore-Bick, was issued in September last year, and we're expecting the government to respond to that in just over a month's time. The report was meticulous and very long, and contained more than 50 recommendations, but only 2 of those related to specific standards. One of them was about BS 750, which is underground fire hydrants, surface box frames and covers specification. And it was recommending really a relatively minor amendment to include a description of the the circumstances under which the flow coefficient to which it refers in paragraph 10.2 is to be measured. That was immediately passed to the responsible technical committee, which is FSH 17. They have agreed to proceed with the amendment, and we expect that to appear towards the end of this year. Standards, as I'm sure many of you will already be aware, have to go through a development process which includes public consultation. So it can sometimes take a little time for an amendment to appear, but that's already in process. The other standard or standards that were referred to specifically in the report were BS 8414 and BS 9414, and respectively their fire performance of external cladding systems and fire performance of external cladding systems, the application of results from the BS 8414 test. That obviously, given the subject matter, was key to the report, but in order to revise those standards, research needs to be completed, which the Building Safety Regulator is working on. We understand that that is in process, and I believe, Chris, we hopefully might be able to start work on those later in the year.
Certainly, Simon. Good afternoon, everybody. It is hoped that as soon as the BSR releases the findings from the research program, we will be able to start immediately. We have a number of the experts who are involved in that research are also members of the drafting panel who will be taking on the work, and we will look to get things underway as soon as possible. Obviously, 9414 needs to be revised after 8414 as it's dependent on the terminology and the recommendations in 8414. Those of you that have read the most recent edition of BS 8414 from the BRE will note at the back there is a section that says BSI has taken over responsibility for the classification criteria. That is a reference to some proposed work that is currently paused, and that was to take the classification criteria from BR 135 and adapt it into a British standard, which was given the provisional number of BS 8135, so that all three standards were together in one family. That work is also on pause, and then will we restart once the research findings have been made available.
Thank you, Chris. While the report only referred to two specific standards, the recommendations in the report referred to only two specific standards, BSI and its committees have been very active in this area since the tragic fire in 2017, and numerous new and revised standards have been published in those 8 years, including, for example, BS 9991, which is fire safety in the design, management and use of residential buildings. This is one of our key fire safety standards. Chris, would you like to say a bit more on that, since you've masterminded it through publication?
Thank you. So it's fair to say that 9991 is the biggest standard that's been published in recent memory. It's certainly one of the most highly anticipated. It is a mammoth tome, which I think is only just being digested by industry and sector currently. It is a document that we are going to be actively maintaining, not just simply through our traditional 5-year systematic review process, where all standards are flagged up for be considered for a revision, but actually as decisions on the recommendations from the Grenfell inquiry are announced by His Majesty's government and obviously and other activities within industry, we will be looking again, and in conjunction with all of the comments and the questions that we've received on 9991 since publication, bringing them to the relevant drafting panel's attention and just considering whether any changes need to be made, not that any of the decisions that the panel made will be reversed, more to ensure that the clarity of the recommendations don't need to be amended. Sometimes what the panel meant and is written down are at odds and needs to just be refined, as well as understanding the impact it is having on industry and society in general.
Thank you. Now, moving on to revised standards that are going to be published this year. I mean, obviously, there are a lot more than just these 4 that we've listed here, but these are just picking out some of them. to bring to your particular attention. In the second quarter of the year, there's a revision to PAS 9980. That's fire risk appraisal of external walls and cladding of flats. Obviously, given how the fire at Grenfell Tower occurred, this is a fairly crucial response to that. It provides a methodology for fire risk appraisal of external walls and cladding construction. There's already been one edition of this PAS, so this is the second, this revision, which will appear in the second quarter of the year. In April, we are expecting BS 5839 Part 1, and this is part of a large series of standards on fire detection and fire alarm systems for buildings. Part 1 is the code of practice for the design, installation, commissioning and maintenance of systems in non-domestic premises. And this is part of a rolling cycle of revisions for this multi-part standard. In June, there will be a new edition of BS 9990, again part of a series of standards, this time the 999 series, and 9990 is non-automatic firefighting systems in buildings, and that's another code of practice. And then in October, we're expecting to see BS 5266 Part 1, which is emergency lighting, code of practice for the emergency lighting of premises. Chris, I don't know if there's anything you'd like to flag up about any of those in particular.
Just to say that the publication of the revised BS 5839 Part 1 will almost certainly lead to work being begun on a revision of Part 6, which is, again, same standard, code of practice for design, installation, commissioning and maintenance of systems in domestic premises. We often try and keep the pair of standards in lockstep, as they often refer to one another quite closely. We will also be starting work on the revision of BS 9999 now that BS 9991 has been published. It will be several years before you see a revised edition published. If we are lucky, it will be the draft public consultation should begin next year. Hopefully, we won't get as many comments as we did on 9991, which was the main reason it took so long to resolve. But again, it's a serious and very important standard, so you should expect that it might take a little bit longer than we would normally anticipate. In addition, later on this year, we are hoping to see the draft public consultation for two new standards in the 999X series. This is BS 9994, Fire Strategies in Buildings Specification, and 9996, Commissioning and Maintenance of Integrated Fire Safety Systems, and that'd be a code of practice. These are two new works, as you will be aware. Fire strategies were mentioned quite extensively in the Phase 2 Grenfell Tower report. Our work was in fact already underway, but the publication of that report has given it new significance. And when the draft for public consultation is coming closer, we will be discussing both of those in a bit more detail and give you an overview as to what they will entail. But at the moment, they are still very much drafts.
And another brand new standard that we are expecting to see by the end of the year, hopefully in October, is BS 9792, which is Fire Risk Assessment Housing Code of Practice. This is in succession to the withdrawn PAS 79 Part 2. It's been used as the base for the creation of a British standard rather than a PAS, using a completely different panel, so fresh eyes on it. This will be a very important standard in fire risk assessment, and we expect to see in the third quarter of the year. Work is also beginning on a code of practice on assessing performance of passive fire protection products. That's based on a document produced by the Passive Fire Protection Federation. That, like the parts of the 999X series that Chris mentioned, is at a very early stage. That hasn't even been through our planning and approval process yet, but we know we are going to move forward with that. Chris, you want to comment on that?
So the 476 series and its removal of a number of parts from a approved document B later on this year and then in 2029 has understandably caused a lot of concern for industry, which was still using 476 in a number of areas. This document, which the Passive Fire Protection Federation have very kindly gifted to us to be able to use as a basis for a new standard with their cooperation, is intended to really kind of smooth over the difficulties that industry may have in transferring to the more established European system, as well as providing some guidance in general to individuals who may be a little bit uncertain as to what the connections is. There is also part of the 476 series, part 10, which is intended as a general introduction to the 476 series, and that is also going to be looked at by the panel just to see if there's any text that can be retained, updated, and perhaps drawn into the new code of practice. So we're hoping that the new document will be a quite robust, authoritative document to assist industry at this period of transition.
Great, thank you, Chris. And also worth mentioning is that FSH0, the Strategy Committee for Fire and Built Environment, which has previously been mentioned, is going to be developing a new strategy to involve a wider range of stakeholders in creating standards. One of the rules we live and breathe is that standards are better when they're developed by a wide range of diverse opinions, and we have always been very active in getting as many different perspectives involved in standards development as possible, but we know we can do better. We know not all of our committees are necessarily as diverse and wide-ranging as we would like them to be. A particular area that we want to focus on, indeed have been focusing on for a number of years now, is getting the perspective of residents. It's a bit of a challenge. We accept that there's sort of no central body that represents residents' views, but it's something we are committed to achieving alongside other perspectives as well. So under the leadership of its new chair, Aman Sharma, FSH0 is going to be focusing on that this year and bringing as many people as we can and as many different perspectives as we can into developing fire safety standards. That brings us to the end of the section on fire safety, and at this point I will seamlessly be left by Chris and rejoined by Ant. We shall move on to sustainability. So sustainability in the built environment is an area we've been focusing on quite a lot in recent years. I'm sure I don't need to explain why its importance will be obvious to everybody. One of the areas in which we have been working and achieving some success is low carbon concrete. So BS 8500, excuse me while I turn the page on my notes, which is the complementary British standard to BS EN 206, and it's about specifying concrete. This was updated in November 2023, and the reason for this update was to include provisions to allow a replacement of a greater percent of Portland cement. So up to 65% of Portland cement can be replaced by 2 or more low carbon supplementary cementitious materials, which are called additions in this standard. Now, given the impact that concrete has and the carbon intensive nature of its production, if we can do something to reduce the amount of the more carbon intensive materials in concrete, that can have an enormous effect in attempting to mitigate climate change. Another part of that is Flex 350. Now, for those who aren't aware, flexes are a very sort of fast-moving standard developed in an iterative way, so they can be almost like software development. They get improved in quick-fire versions. So Flex 350, which is alternative binder systems for lower carbon concrete, which is a code of practice. The second version of this was published in 2024. And we have an ambition eventually to develop that into a new part of the BS 8500 series, because as you'll hopefully see from how I've described it, it fits quite well next to parts 1 and 2 for reducing the carbon intensity of concrete. Now, alongside this work on low carbon concrete, our participation in standards for a more sustainable built environment continues at a European and international level. So in the UK, we have a national committee, B558, on sustainability of construction works. This mirrors both a SEN committee and SEN TC350, which has the same title, Sustainability of Construction Works, and works at the European level. And at a global level, it mirrors ISO TC59 SC17, which is Sustainability in Buildings and Civil Engineering Works. For anyone who's not familiar with how the system works, mirroring means a UK committee that provides our input into those European and international committees to make sure that the UK perspective is represented and taken account of. Now, unusually, SEN TC350 has a subcommittee. Most European committees don't, but this one does because of the importance of the subject matter, which is circular economy in the construction sector. Now, this was only set up 3 or 4 years ago, I think. It's a relatively recent one, and its work program is only really starting to get going, but they have been establishing working groups. I think they're up to about 6 now. And that is mirrored by B5581, so a subcommittee of National Committee B558. So through those committees, we ensure that the UK is represented on this key topic at both European and international levels.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you. Moving over to grow, from my perspective, I think people will be very much aware of the suite of energy efficiency retrofit standards that we publish, PAS 2035, 2030, which I'll talk about a bit more in a moment, but also PAS 28, which is for non-domestic scenarios. But back to 2035 and 2030, there is an ongoing cycle of revision for these important PAS documents. You'll be glad to know that the revision cycle has started for the next review, and we're looking to hopefully secure public consultation around late April of this year, with publication in September. I mean, many comments have been fed in. It will be considered in the round. Perhaps one of the largest pieces of new content will go into PAS 2035, which is basically a best practice guide for end-to-end whole house retrofits. Is how best we do in the future. Can we provide a methodology for assessing, developing and innovative products? Rightfully, given the importance of many products that support retrofit, is that they have to go through due process to ensure that they are fit for purpose, they perform the way they suggest, and they are safe for incorporation. So working with stakeholders and government, hopefully as part of this next revise, we'll see that methodology and a pathway for innovative products to hopefully allow them to be aware of what they're obliged to do and speed them up to getting to market and for acceptance in energy efficiency retrofit solutions. So that's energy efficiency retrofit. And I also just want to touch upon today, it's still very early news. From our perspective, we are mindful and we continue to work with industry that we need to produce more content, more standards in the whole sort of climate change adaptation and resilience perspective. But we have just agreed with the ICE, who are kindly sponsoring this next PAS, and it will be a PAS looking at requirements for developing and applying adaptation pathways within the infrastructure sector. Again, all about aiding adaptation decision making, building upon PAS 2080 and many other of our standards. So this new document will be looking to provide guidance on how you best choose appropriate climate change scenarios. It will give guidance on how you incorporate that consideration in addition to being cognizant of design life constraints of some of these assets. And it's also about establishing the other co-benefits of achieving adaptation pathway with such infrastructure installations, and think about how it fits with net zero and sustainability needs as well. So again, don't even know the number yet for this forthcoming PAS, but watch this space. I'm sure we'll be talking about this later in the year. Back to you, Simon.
Thank you, Ant. So later in the year, we're expecting another new standard to appear, which is BS 4104. And this is retrofit assessment for domestic properties. It's designed to work alongside the previously mentioned PAS 2035-2030. As I'm sure everyone's aware, a statistic that is sort of well known in this area is that of the buildings that are going to be in use in 2050, 80% of them have already been built. So retrofit to to achieve energy efficiency is going to be an essential way in which we ensure that the housing stock is suitable for a lower carbon, lower energy intensive world. In PAS 2080, which many of you may already have heard of, is about carbon management for infrastructure and buildings. This was the second edition of this PAS. The first version concentrated on infrastructure. The second version has added buildings to that. It's been enormously successful, very high uptake, a lot of interest in this because of how it can help us to address the challenges of climate change. It's been mainly UK focused at the moment, so the ambition is to propose this as the basis for a new ISO to take it global. We think it can have an enormous impact at that level. Work is only just starting on that. It's a relatively long process, but we are keen to get started with it, and we think there'll be a lot of interest in that at a global level. So watch this space on the internationalization of PAS 2080. Also at ISO level, another exciting project that we're working on is ISO Workshop Agreement 42. Now, a workshop agreement isn't quite an ISO standard, but it's a step on the road to that. And work is already underway on this to develop ISO's first international standard on net zero. This will provide clarity on the net zero transition, robust requirements, and ultimately enable independently verified and comprehensive climate action and accelerate progress towards a sustainable world. An important point to note about this is that it is cross-sector. It's not just built environment, because climate change affects us all, no matter what sector we work in. But to flip that around, it's as important and applicable to the built environment as it is to everywhere else. So we hope that there will be a lot of interest in that from the built environment sector as from others. That brings us to the end of our session on sustainability, and I'm now going to pass across to Dan Rossiter.
Thank you very much, Simon, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dan. Like Ian, one of our sector leads, and I typically focus on things that are typically digital, new or shiny. So I get to play with lots of nice things. And in terms of some of the focuses we're focused on in those sorts of areas, the first I'll talk about is what we're sort of maintaining. Many of you will be aware of the strength that we have had as BSI within the BIM and information management space, originally with the PAS 1192 series, transitioning to the 19650 series. We've helped enjoy and push the way that good practice happens in relation to information management for a number of years now. One of the key drivers has been that sort of towards the end of the summer last year, NEMA helped launch the revised information management initiative, looking at effectively how we kind of collectively create our own organizational mandates to push good information management within the UK. And we're continuing to support that sort of work, engaging closely with the likes of the Construction Industry Council and with NEMA. You'll note there that some key publications are that we are imminently going to adopt and then publish nationally 19650 Part 6. My understanding is we're currently waiting for CEN to adopt it themselves, and then we will adopt it our side. So that's coming very, very soon. And in the kind of midterm, we're currently working on the revisions of 19650 Parts 1, 2, and 3. It's scary to think it's already been 5 years since they originally published back in 2018 or more, in that sort of sense. So we're just looking to maintain the good work we have around information management in that sort of space. In terms of how we're trying to kind of grow sort of new areas, a key focus I'll put out today is around modern methods of construction. We do have a national committee, CB301, that does some really interesting work. And currently, I think one of the pieces of work it's doing, which I think is going to be really interesting, is its look at the MMC categories and a way that maybe we can reach a kind of revised consensus-based version of that we can build in some core definitions for each of those kind of typologies within it. At the same time, there's exciting work happening with the, I guess now MHCLG sponsored PAS 8700, which is going to focus on how modern methods of construction work and their relation to the life cycle stages in that sense. So it gives a real good feel of this idea of thinking about modern methods very early on, even kind of a pre-project basis, talking about things like a program level approach. It brings in things like design for manufacturing and assembly, or DFMA, in that sense, and really starts to bring a lot of these concepts together. We had a fantastic response from industry. We had, I think, over 750 comments on the PAS, many of which have been positive, others rightfully pointing out things for us to revise and amend. So hopefully once we have those fixed, and again, maybe perhaps around the spring at that point, we will be excitedly able to publish PAS 8700 for you guys to enjoy. And in that way, we again talking to lots of key stakeholders, people like the CLC as mentioned, but also organizations like Build Offsite, the Offsite Alliance, and others as well. And then, it'll be remiss to me to talk about digital and sort of quality in this space without talking about everyone's favorite subject, which is artificial intelligence. Over the last couple of years, a lot has splashed into the news and into our daily lives around AI and its power. So much so that we as BSI have for quite a while been supporting the Innovate UK Bridge AI program, which is doing research and sort of supporting small businesses in how to utilize AI to help them sort of incubate themselves into a viable, growing business. And part of that, we've done a fair bit of mapping of our data and digital standards in the built environment to support those trying to use AI within those spaces. We had a number of workshops, and effectively the feedback was that people weren't interested necessarily in construction AI standards. We have a good foundational set of AI standards, and we have a good set of data and digital standards. And what they wanted to understand was, how do these actually work together? And that's effectively the subject of a new PAS we're currently working on, the first meeting of which is happening this week, PAS 1958, which is going to focus on that mapping. And the idea being that it'll look at how the different standards that we have within our National Committee B555 and other related committees actually interoperate with each other, so that someone can read it, have a look and see where their data, digital, AI or other kind of initiatives could fit in, and what are the relevant standards that may support them. Interestingly, when it comes to things like AI, there's that kind of battle between the efficiency aspect of it and the lack of transparency. And we've been having interesting discussions in-house around perhaps how we might use AI in some of our own standard stuff. And the insights we've been hearing from industry are really interesting around the fact that even when doing something like equations out of standards, people want to be able to see the equations and how they're working and get the audit trail. People aren't willing to accept kind of a black box approach because they need to understand it for the accountability. So it's trying to balance that kind of good practice aspect of how do you utilize the technology, but also ensure that the transparency is there. And in the way that we've been doing that, we've been working with people like Innovate UK, the Alan Turing Institute, and others. But of course, we've also been doing quite a lot on the quality side. And I know that Ian has been keen to talk about some of those bits. So I'll invite Ian back to talk about some of the work we're planning to do engaging on BS 9001. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Really appreciate the opportunity just to jump in at the end of your slide. Thank you for what you've covered. And I think it does link a lot to what you're saying about that insight piece, because of course, 99001 has actually been published for a number of years now. And you reach the point where you think, because it's so heavily linked to 9001, as you can imagine, the generic quality management system standard that exists, it is coming up to its revision, which we may see next year. So there is a point in our lives with 99,000, we need to establish, one, how has it been used? Who's picked it up and used it? In what way? What benefits have you seen? But also there's a part of it to say, well, have you never heard of it? What is it about your quality management that you're perhaps doing that you're not using 99,001, and would you be interested in doing so? So something we perhaps need to do a little more of with our standards, that impact assessment, and understanding how we should then revise and re-edit our standards to become as helpful and useful in the marketplace, exactly as you described with those shiny bits that you touched on earlier, Dan. So that survey's been developed, the questions have developed at the moment with our team here, and that will be issued within a few weeks. Really encourage you, if you can find it and spot it, get in touch with me, ian.richardson@bsigroup.com, if you wish to find out more about the survey, and we would love to hear from you on that. So thanks, Dan.
Brilliant, thank you, Ian. I believe we're now going to move on to probably the most important part of this session, which is the Q&A.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Ian. Yes, please. And if if colleagues can come back on, turn their cameras and microphones on, we've got quite a myriad of questions lined up for you, some really good ones. So I think we've got till about 8 minutes past 1, if that's okay. So we've got plenty of time for this. I'm sure you'll agree the team have given you a really good overview. I know there are lots there. I appreciate that, but do obviously, when you provide the feedback, you'll get the recording of the webinar, and please do take the time to have a look at that, and do share it with colleagues too. By the same token, we'll be publishing, if it's not already on our website, a bit of an update on what we're doing over the course of this year for future webinars. And again, we'll do deep dives on some of these areas therein as well. So let's start with some questions then, team. I mean, loads in, but let's start perhaps with where we started, which is definitively the all-important standards position. So really aimed at Simon and Cara to begin with. What is the most reliable source to get up-to-date, accurate BSI standards information, and how is that accessed?
I'll take this one. Yeah, if you Google lots of different things, you get a ton of different sources and quality of sources and all sorts of different things. But what I would say is, if you just Google BSI standards development, you will find a website that is BSI standards development. And on there, you can find committee information and the scope of the committee, and you can find standard information as well. And also who is on that committee developing the standard, which organization, so you can see that there as well. So if you just type in, I don't know, whatever you want, 19650 or something, then the committee will come up and you can click on there, or you can click on the various different versions of 19650 and look to see what it's about and where it's at in its development stage, as it were. And it's not just national ones. I mentioned 19650, which obviously is an ISO, but there's national, European, and international on there as well. So there's a whole version. That probably is the most definitive source. Our website, you can go to that as well. But mainly, I would say that our telephone number is on there, and there's a lot of different telephone numbers. So just BSI group, you can call us up and find out if you have a specific question on a committee or a standard as well. And lastly, just drop us one of us an email if you have that. Ian gave his email earlier on, so maybe we should just field them all to him. But if you have our email address, then just ask us. I've sent lists of what we're expecting to publish in the year or the next 5 years, or what's recently published, to a number of different places and organizations. We can always put those together for you relatively easily. And then the last place really for general stuff, iso.org is a great website that you can find a lot of information on, and the senelec.eu as well. There's some information on there for more general bits and pieces of how some of our ISO committees and who is the secretariat and things like that, if you want some information from there. So I would start with the BSI standards development page and then work your way down depending on what you need.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Cara. There's been the conference team, our events team, have put some links in the chat for you all, and we'll see if we can get the standards development portal put in there as well. So thank you, Cara. You've mentioned Sen and ISO, and that's very relevant. So really another question around standards making process. Why does BSI work so closely with Sen and ISO, and what are the benefits to the UK? Simon?
Thanks. Yes, I can field that one. The simple answer is that the wider the reach of standards, the more effective they are, the more they help people, the more they help companies. Standards help ensure that components fit together so that a manufacturer can source things from other countries. Importantly, the benefit to the UK is they facilitate trade. That's one of the key reasons for the existence both of BSI and for Sen and for ISO. They enable British companies to export. They help with the flow of trade around the world. As I mentioned in my piece about fire safety, Sen and ISO, or even sustainability, Sen and ISO are the bodies at which we represent the UK's view on standards. So that's why we have these mirror committees working with the European level and the international level committees. We send delegates to those committees to ensure that the UK's view is represented. So we have a say in this. It's not just Europe or ISO saying you must do this. We have as much of a stake in it as other countries do. We make sure the UK point of view is heard, and that's reflected in the standards that are developed. There is something called the single standards model. The idea behind that is that there should only be one standard that's current at any one time. So if a British standard is in conflict with, that is, it covers the same scope, the same subject matter as a European standard, it's withdrawn so that there isn't any confusion, you know which one to use. That's required at the European level. It's not required at the ISO level. We can choose which ones to adopt, but again, we wouldn't have two that were covering the same area. But essentially, it enables British companies to trade in a global world more effectively. That's the reason we work so closely with them.
Brilliant. Thank you, Simon. And certainly when we think about how innovative and ahead of sort of time we've been over the years working with our committee experts on the sector, a lot of the precursor standards that ultimately led to 9001, building information model in the 19650 started with British standards. So when we do elevate into SEN or take into ISO, then, as you say, the experience is already there in the marketplace, and that's very powerful for BSI.
Yeah, just to add to it, and of course, then the impact is magnified as well. That you're talking about international standardization. I know there was a case study done going back to the international standard. We talk about management system standards, the energy management system standard. I believe it was 3M did a case study a few years ago about implementing 50001 in all of their sites globally. So that consistent best practice, all of their sites in every country where they're, it cost them about $4 million to implement the standard, but they saved $24 million in energy efficiency savings, a net gain of $20 million by implementing an international standard. So I think it goes back to that point we were making about impact, that actually when you can be that consistent globally across all your sites, you magnify the benefit to your own business. So I don't think that can be underestimated.
No, you're right. Great point to raise. Thank you, Ian. And we're going to stay with you, Ian. This one's directed directly at you. So for Ian, it's a good one. Do you feel, following the government's response to the Grenfell report, the BSI may take a more regulatory audit role with the BSR relating to compliance with specification standards?
Yeah, I think that's the type of discussion that probably has begun. We've taken some steps, as you know, Anne, to try and bring. We started with that message at the beginning of the health, safety, and well-being slide, where we talk about a heavily regulated industry. We talk about three regulatory bodies to some extent, with OPSS, MHCLG, and the BSR. Maybe focusing a little bit on construction products and competence particularly. But you've got an enormous amount of standards there. You've got an enormous role that they play. And I think we took a decision quite some time ago to make sure that any conversations that we were having on those topics involved all three of those regulators, but especially following the Building Safety Act, the Building Safety Regulator. So those conversations have been happening for some time. Now, the may word is maybe the emphasis there more than anything. But I think, for sure, there are certainly on the horizon things that are going to happen. We talk about the CPR revision and how that will be implemented in the UK. What role does BSI play in that? And I think when you've got standards, you've got the approved documents, you've got minimum technical competency. This is why I think when you start to talk about our relationship with those regulators and how standards can play a role in compliance, I don't think we rule anything out at the moment. What's positive, I suppose, is that the door is open for that dialogue, and we are already having it. Now we have to wait for certain things to happen, like responses to the Grenfell Tower inquiry report and what the government will decide to do about the recommendations or not. One of those was a single construction regulator. What will happen if that came to pass? So I would say, I don't know if we have definitive answers to this, but what I would say is categorically, certain for me that BSI has to be quite front and center with the solution for sure. And I think we've covered a lot of that today without over-egging the pudding about a Grenfell Tower inquiry response. It's clear that it's a thread through everything that we're looking to do in the year ahead.
No, that's a really valid point. And certainly from where I sit, in my experience as a former regulator and somebody that was called before the Grenfell inquiry as well, rightfully so, we can't forget who we are as BSI, as the national standards body. So that's a multitude of parts of providing best practice guidance to the marketplace to ensure better compliance and similar, but also making sure we support our regulators in what is a huge landscape. As we touched upon earlier, just the enormity of what the team publish and oversee at a national and European level on construction product standards is utterly enormous, and staying on track of that and are waiting to see what MHCLG comes out with future policy with construction products and safety critical, but what that eventually means, construction products will be key. Staying with that, really, I've got a multitude of questions which I'm going to try and blend very simply, but a lot of interest in those joining us today to watch the update around competency and construction products as well. However, you've touched upon some of it, but more broadly, given the core activity that we undertook, supported by MHCLG, on competency standards for defined roles, could you say a bit more about other upcoming standards in the competency space? And even if you're able to, some of the discussions you're having more broadly, even nascent discussions about where people want to focus more about competency and what more BSI can do.
Yeah, and I think Cara made a couple of points in her section about the fact that we're scratching the surface. That we shouldn't underestimate the fact that every single one of these topics could have a webinar in its own right. And I'm sure in your wrap up, Ant, you will explain how some of those topics will get their own webinar at some point in the year and direct people to them. But in terms of trying to understand exactly what that competence suite currently looks like, 8671, 8672 and 8673 are now more than 2 years old. So there needs to be a discussion about how they've been embedded in industry. And certainly when we talk about the Building Safety Act, they are framework for framework documents. So they are being used, they have been embedded. How do we then support the industry to say, we might have looked at those individual job titles within the Building Safety Act, but how do you then broaden that out? And I know there has been support from the BSR on the topic of organisational capability. I think that's a massive one that we're exploring at the moment. And there has been support within the committee to say it's vital that we do standardise. The difficulty, of course, is then, as we said, to scope it out into something that's manageable. How does that sort of tackle topics that are very emotive and very difficult, like culture within the industry? How do you move that forward with a standard? And that's why I think we've been a little delayed with moving that forward. But then, of course, the ones that are coming down that were mentioned in the GTI final report, fire risk engineers and how the standard there, the assessors standard that's coming that Cara mentioned, 8674, and then 8670 was split into two parts. The construction product competency standard, 8670 part 2, will arrive probably in the early part of next year. But I think it's then saying, okay, all of those are in the pipeline, but how do you connect them all together? And I think there has been some work done within the ICSG, the Industry Competence Steering Group, to reinforce that. So I think we just need to understand perhaps not just what standards are needed, but how they are effectively implemented together. What collectively can we give as guidance to support an industry that already has a number of standards that it's trying to do, not just on competence, but sustainability and digital and quality as well. And so, lots being thrown at them. I think it goes back to BSI's role as the NSB, that we have a responsibility to help people navigate through use and implementation of these standards too.
Thank you, Ian. Last couple of questions. We are getting a bit tight on time, but these are really important. Chris, you kindly touched upon the importance of 9991, and perhaps it's too early, but is there anything you want to say about how it's been received and recognised in the sector so far, and anything people should be aware of moving forward?
Thank you, Ant. So it's clear to say that a standard as big as 9991 is going to cause ripples as it lands. It is going to take time for people to digest it and to understand its impact. I think it is too early for us to have a definitive opinion as to how it's landed. Broadly speaking, the feedback has been very good. People have been waiting for the revision for quite a number of years. It's been actively followed by a large segment of the industry, and as people have been watching the Grenfell Tower inquiry and seeing the recommendations come out, there has been a high level of interest as to what 9991 will do and how it will address the safety concerns that have been raised since 2017. That being said, it is a voluntary code of practice. It is not law. There isn't a legal obligation for it to be used, although we will certainly encourage it to be used. And we've had to take some time just to try and industry and sector that is an example of what good looks like. It is not mandatory. Much like the other guidances out in industry. But we take the guidance seriously. We're not going to just publish it and say, okay, but that's it for the next 5 or however many years it may be into the next. We are actively looking at it. I have a meeting in less than 2 weeks, actually, with the drafting panel, just for us to catch up and have a look at the comments that have been raised post-publication, where clarity may need to be improved, where it hasn't been. And we're also using it as a way of basically learning lessons on the standards development process itself. What happens if we have another one of these big standards with a record-breaking number of comments? How do we manage that? To give you an idea, a standard usually takes 18 months from the very first meeting to publication. This standard took over 2 years just to resolve the comments that were received. It received over 1,800 comments and took over 300 hours to go through every single comment and to come to a consensus and a lot of going back and forth. Obviously, that's a good sign because it does show the due diligence that committee members are paying and the importance that we place upon it within BSI. But it is also a challenge because it means that the updated guidance takes even longer to get to out to an industry, which is desperately needing for it. So I think 991 is going to be a watershed standard for a number of reasons. As I said, I think it's far too early for us to come to a definitive view, but I'm excited about it. I was very proud to have worked on it, and I believe it will ultimately be a benefit for the country.
Absolutely, and a huge amount of work by our panel experts, over 30 that worked on this, and a big shout out to them. I'm unfortunately failed already because I've gone over by a minute in terms of this webinar, so I'm going to have to draw it to a close. Dan, apologies, I didn't get a chance to draw you in, but there's quite a bit of interest around SMART and what that means to BSI and where people can find out more about what we're doing on SMART. So perhaps that's something we can draw in to the response on this webinar thereafter. I suggest, thank you team, brilliant as always. We need to bring this now to a close. From my perspective, hopefully you found that's useful. It does set the scene very much as to what we're working on, which we can only do with yourselves and our all-important committee experts. But there will be more webinars, typically monthly throughout the year, and we continue our partnership with the IFE as well. In terms of things to keep an eye out for, we've got another broader online fire conference on the 10th of March, so I think that will be quite pertinent. And there'll be a much bigger global built environment summit. So that does bring all of BSI Group together, okay? Not just knowledge solutions, but also colleagues in certification assurance and training. But we'll be very clear on who does what. Again, watch this space and do keep an eye out for future webinars and topics therein that will follow this year. Other than that, from my perspective, I need to say thank you. Big thank you to yourselves for making the time in your busy diaries to join us today. I do hope you found it useful. Please do provide feedback and give us ideas of what else you want us to talk about in the future. Big shout out to the Built Environment team. You're brilliant. Thank you. And so we couldn't do it without you. And of course, a big shout out to the Built Environment, to the events team as well, that's actually made this all happen today. Thank you. This is a far better platform. And so other than that, thank you and goodbye, and have a good rest of the day. Take care. Bye for now.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.